first thing I'm going to do is get those tenderloins out of there. So I'll just show you real quick. So it's just a chunk of muscle that these we call tenderloins. This chunk of muscle right here along the spine, and it sits right in this kind of dish here between the spine and these short ribs on the back here. You can see that. So you just cut it off up here. It attaches to the pelvis back here, and then you just take your knife and kind of whittle it out of that cradle that it sits in there. But this is what it looks like when it's out. These are the tenderloins from the buck that I just shot last weekend. I'm going to get these cleaned up. These are going to be part of dinner tonight. There's actually a little bit of work to do. We're going to rinse these off and make sure that we get all the hair and anything else that might be on these off. This is one of the few cuts of meat on a venison that you would cook the same as any other tenderloin. In my opinion, it's one of the choice cuts of meat, most tender pieces of the deer. So just like a pig or a cow or whatever, you're going to get this smaller piece that comes from the inside of the spine. I'll show you where I got that from. But we're just going to trim off any of this fat. There's a little piece of meat that we're going to take off the inside of this, and I'm going to just add that to the hamburger pile. But again, with venison, elk or bear or any game meat, you don't want to leave any of the wild fat on these. So when you're cleaning these up, like I mentioned, there was a couple of the little pieces of meat around this. If they're separated, they're just hooked together, attached together by membrane in between. So if you just gently pull on this and take the knife and just kind of cut that membrane loose, then you're going to be able to easily separate those muscle groups, which is when we start doing the front shoulders and the hind quarters, probably one of the most important things to keep in mind. So you can see that just came apart really nice. We've got one chunk of meat here. So on these tenderloins, the grain of the meat actually runs a little bit of an angle on this end, and then as it gets closer to this end, it kind of straightens out and runs parallel to the length of this. So if we want this to come out super tender, we're going to start cutting this at an angle back here to be perpendicular to the grain with the blade, and then as I get more towards the front, I'm going to straighten it out to maintain that perpendicular cut to the grain of the meat so it comes out as tender as it can possibly be. Backstrap out next, which is this solid chunk of meat that runs the full length of the spine right down to the top of the pelvis here. This is one of the more choice cuts in my opinion. But you're just gonna cut right where that line is, you can see it, and then follow the ribs and then where the top of the spine is. So it just sits in kind of this cradle in between the ribs and the spine. So I've got this off the ribs, and you can see this is a completely separate piece of meat. So when you're cutting this off, if you can get right in between these muscle groups, you're gonna come out with just a beautiful chunk of meat. But you just follow the ribs down to the spine. Now I'm going to take the knife and find the edge of the spine and finish cutting this thing out. So I'm just getting ready to start cleaning up one of the 2 tenderloins off the deer I got last weekend. This is a pretty easy piece to clean. It's just a big solid chunk of muscle. There's a couple others that wrap around on this that we're going to clean off. I'll also take all this little silver skin off on both sides. We'll trim this muscle off here. The muscle grain on this runs perpendicular to the length for the most part. So when you're cutting it, whether you're cutting it in chunks for searing or roast or however you want to cook it, we usually cut these into steaks, but you can usually cut them just perpendicular to the length and gives you the best grain for the most tender cut. So when I'm cleaning this up, so this is I called it the tender, or the backstrap. So when I'm cleaning this up, this is, as I mentioned, this is a backstrap. So this would be cut, like if you were looking at pork or beef, this would be called the loin. But you can see as I'm taking this apart, we just want this one strip of muscle that goes through here. So I want all these other ones off of here because the grains all run different directions. So you'd get one piece that was tender and one piece that was tough. So I'm just going to take this completely apart. But you just want to kind of follow the seam of the muscle. And that way, as you're finishing processing each piece, all the grain is run in the same direction. And it makes it much easier to get all the silver skin and fat and stuff out of there too. But so I just wanted to show kind of what this looked like as I'm taking this apart. You can see a little bit better up here. So if you just put a little pressure on it, like you can see, and then you just take the tip of your knife, and if you're good and sharp, all you gotta do is just kind of touch it and it just separates that right out. Same as with all the other game meats, we wanna make sure and get all of the animal's fat off and as much of the silver skin as we can, as well as be meticulous with getting the hair off of it too. Okay, so I just cut these up in about serving size chunks just to make them a little easier to manage on the cutting table, but I just got this piece finished up. It's got a little hair there. But these pieces are pretty easy to clean, but there shouldn't be anything left on this. It should just be meat. Okay, so I just got these vacuum sealed, which is my preferred method for prepping for storage. Very little chance of this getting freezer burned even after a year or two. And then always clearly mark what's in each package. I left these pieces in chunks instead of cutting them into steaks, and that way we have the option when we thaw them out to decide how we want to cook these, if we want to cook them as a roast and sear them, or cut them into steaks and cook them on the barbecue, or whatever. There's a bunch of different ways to cut these or cook these because they're such a tender cut of meat. But headed for the freezer.